To get an idea of how our citizens felt about the antler restriction, we conduct firearms hunter attitude surveys as well as some landowner attitude surveys. Some results. This is a typical 1.5-year-old buck. Instead of presenting a whole series of graphs, it just kind of gets to me kind of boring. I'm just going to give you an overview of the results of the antler restriction. And the way we analyzed this is we had the control counties and we had the counties with the antler restriction. And basically, we looked at the changes in harvest over the period of the study in the control counties and assumed that that would have happened in the experimental counties if we hadn't had an antler restriction. So we looked at the changes in harvest in the control counties and came up with an expected number of deer we would have harvested in the counties with the antler restriction and compared it with what we actually took in those counties with the antler restriction. So we're looking at what we would have expected based on what we actually saw, and our conclusion is that this is the effect of the antler restriction regulation on various aspects of our harvest. The first thing I look at here is the antler restriction effects on doe harvest. And again, one of our primary intents in this antler restriction was to shift harvest pressure from bucks to does. So we wanted to take some pressure off bucks and increase pressure on does. In that northern group of counties under the antler restriction, we really didn't see a change in doe harvest as a result of the regulation. And so there really was no effect on doe harvest in that northern group. But in that central group, we saw an average of 13% increase in doe harvest as a result of the antler restriction regulation. A little surprising to us, but in retrospect, probably shouldn't have been all that surprising. In that northern group of counties, we've been very liberal in our regulations. Hunters could take as many antlerless deer as they wanted in those counties for many years, and that's what people were doing. When you put an antler restriction up there, take away the opportunity to shoot a 1.5-year-old buck, they're already shooting all the antlerless deer they want, and so we kind of expected, we should have expected to see not much effect of the antler restriction in that northern group of counties. In the central group of counties, we have more moderate deer populations. Our regulations are more restrictive. They can only use one antlerless permit. Less opportunity to shoot a deer in that country, and when you take away the opportunity to shoot that 1.5-year-old buck, it was much more likely to shift to does. And so I think that's why we saw that increase in doe harvest in that central group of counties. Effect of the antler restriction on buck harvest, we saw and I grouped both the northern group and the central group for the analysis of bucks because there really wasn't much difference between the northern and central group. But we saw an average of 66% reduction in 1.5-year-old buck harvest, and this wasn't surprising. Before we went to the antler restriction, we had determined that under a 4-point rule in Missouri, we would expect between 65 and 70% of the 1.5-year-old buck to be protected, and the harvest really points that out or confirms that. So it was just as we expected. 2.5-year-old buck harvest. The first year we would expect to see an impact of the antler restriction on 2.5-year-old buck harvest was in 2005, and from 2005 through 2007. We saw about a 20% increase in the number of 2.5-year-old bucks taken under the antler restriction that we could attribute to the regulation itself. 3.5-year-old bucks, the first year we would expect to see an impact on 3.5-year-old bucks was in 2006. And in 2006 and 2007, they averaged about 62% increase in the number of 3.5-year-old bucks that were taken that we could attribute to the antler restriction. And then finally, 4.5-year-old and older. 2007 was the first year we would expect to see an effect there, and we had about a 200% increase in the number of 4.5-year-old bucks taken as a result of the antler restriction regulation. Now, before you jump to the conclusion that in northern Missouri we had a 4.5-year-old buck behind every tree, you have to realize that without an antler restriction, only a very small percentage of our buck harvest is 4.5-year-old. So a 200% increase isn't necessarily equate to a huge increase in the total number of 4.5-year-old bucks that were taken, but it did amount to several thousand more 4.5-year-old bucks taken. If you look at the effect of the antler restriction on overall buck harvest, the adult buck harvest increased progressively. So that by 2007, we saw a 36% increase in the number of 2.5-year-old and older bucks taken. As I mentioned earlier, this analysis looked at the effect of the regulation itself, and not necessarily doesn't equate to the actual increase in the number of adult bucks taken. In other words, the actual increase in the number of 2.5-year-old and older bucks in those counties with the antler restriction was between 50 and 60%, and not 36%. And the reason I have 36% here is because we were seeing an increase in the adult bucks taken in our control counties too. And I think this is, as Kip was talking about, hunters are increasingly voluntarily laying off those 1.5-year-old bucks, and I think that's what was happening in our control counties. Hunters aren't as likely to shoot 1.5-year-old bucks, and I think almost being adjacent to those antler restriction counties, more and more people were laying off the 1.5-year-old bucks. So we saw an increase in our control counties as well as the experimental counties, and the increase that we could attribute to the regulation was 36%. Overall buck harvest decreases. As Moret mentioned, you know, if you're going to implement an antler restriction, you're going to lose some adult buck harvest. And in Missouri, by the 4th year of the study, was 18% reduction in antlered buck harvest. And it only makes sense. In Missouri, most of the bucks can't be shot at 1.5. They have to live one more year longer before they become a legal deer. There's some natural mortality that occurs there. There's some illegal harvesting that occurs there. And as a result, the overall buck harvest will decrease under an antler restriction. And I think in Missouri, after 5 or 6 years, that's going to range between 15 and 20% reduction in your buck harvest. Overall harvest in the north group of counties decreased by 8% by 2007. So not only is there a decrease in the buck harvest, there's an overall decrease in harvest in that north group, but in the center group of counties there wasn't a change. And the difference here is that in that northern group, the reduction in buck harvest wasn't compensated by an increase in doe harvest, whereas in the central group it was. So it really didn't have an impact on total harvest in that central group of counties. In terms of hunter perceptions, in our questionnaires we asked hunters their perceptions of the number of adult bucks now compared to what it was 5 years ago. And this blue line represents the respondents that were hunting in counties with antler restriction. And you can see throughout the study that they're progressively increased. And so in other words, the perception of the hunters was that the number of adult bucks was increasing. The control counties were flat, and we really didn't see that change that we saw. So certainly the impact of the antler restriction was the perception that there were more adult bucks out there. We also asked a question about buck sign, and we started asking this question in 2005, which was the 2nd year of the study, so we don't have an initial response, but it tended to be higher than in the control. So it appears that there is some perception that there was more buck sign as a result of the antler restriction. Brett presented some information on progression of satisfaction with the antler restriction. I've got graphs, but I didn't bring that. But over time, increasing interest and increasing acceptance of the antler restriction. This map shows the 2007 response to the question, do you like the antler restriction, basically. The darker counties are counties in which at least 70% of the hunters were in favor of the antler restriction. So you can see in northern Missouri and central Missouri, great support for the antler